Welcome Golden State educators and perhaps even some teachers that are watching from other states. While we certainly miss having face-to-face in-place conventions, one of the benefits of switching a convention from face-to-face to virtual is often you're able to reach more teachers. So some of you may be tuning in from other places that wouldn't have been there at the normal fall convention. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to some of you. I know this is a more unusual session. It's just talking about books. But these are books that I have read or have been reading in the last several years, some that I have reread, some that I have read for the first time. And I find all of them to be extremely beneficial and helpful in my constant training, my constant growing, my constant learning as a teacher. And although there are so many more books that I could talk about, you've likely received a handout from the Golden State Association of Christian Schools that contains notes for other sessions, and it should also have the notes for this session. And that's going to give you the titles, the bibliographic information about these books and these resources that I mentioned. So I could have put a lot more. In fact, I probably already put a little too much there to try to talk about quickly. But just know that these I highly recommend to just about every single teacher. And if it's been a few years, if some of the titles look familiar to you, if you read some of them perhaps in your teacher training or a couple years ago, I recommend reading them again. In fact, the first one that we will start with, it's already been close to 3 years since I've read it, and as I was looking through it again to create this session, I began to think, I need to go back and read this through again. I need to continually sharpen what I picked up from the book the first time. Now, I've divided the books into 5 categories. Those categories are teaching techniques, classroom management, Christian education, general education. I will not have time to really go and talk about the resources I suggest for cognitive science, but you do have that bibliographic information there on your handout. If for some reason you're watching this, you don't have that handout, please feel free to email me. I included my email purposefully on the title slide as well as on the finishing slide. So cquinlan@abeka.com. Feel free to email me. I will forward you that bibliographic information, and I'll also make references throughout the session that if you have some things that as you're reading the book, you're a little bit surprised, or you think, is Cindy saying that we should read that? Let me point out a disclaimer that not all of the content in these resources is content that Abeka, which is the company I represent, or even I would endorse or support. So even as I read through them, there are some things that I say, well, I wouldn't follow that, or I wouldn't listen to that. But the bulk of the information here, I would agree with, and I would encourage you to apply. In fact, that reminds me, you don't technically know who I am yet. I haven't introduced myself. I always joke with people, I am textbook Martha. I like to get straight down into the business, and I sometimes forget those nice hello, how are you, good mornings. My name is Cindy Quinlan. I am an educational consultant with Abeka, so I'm currently based in Pensacola, Florida. I had taught for several years at a Christian school in Northern Virginia, and I've also taught some years on, some years off here at Pensacola Christian Academy. And this year I'm back again in the classroom with them. And it's been an interesting year. Many of you can attest to that with COVID. And then you've had fires, and we recently had a hurricane. So it's just been one of those teaching years that you think to yourself, this will be a year to talk about in the future. When we get through this year, we'll feel as if we can handle just about everything. Let me jump into these books though. Honestly, as I was writing notes about these books, I put down so much more than I know I will be able to share. So as I referenced earlier that I included my email address, if there's something you want to clarify or if there's something you have questions about, feel free to email me. I love talking to teachers about teaching. I love talking to people about books. I would love to hear from you, even if just to say, hey, here's a book that I recommend, or hey, this was my takeaway from that book. That would enrich me, and that would perhaps enrich others because I'd be able to pass along your suggestions. Now, this first category we'll look at is teaching techniques, and the first book that I want us to look at is Doug Lima's book called Teach Like a Champion. Now, I'm specifically showing the second edition, his 2.0 version, which has 62 techniques, only because that's the book that I read. But I've heard his first edition is just as good. In fact, one of our educational professors here at Pensacola Christian College even prefers the first book. So the first and second edition are both great. But what is really phenomenal phenomenal about Teach Like a Champion is that it specifies, clarifies, and exemplifies techniques that every single teacher can learn and implement. So what the author did is he observed so many really good teachers. And instead of keeping things general and broad, really good teachers are always paying attention, or really good teachers, they push their students to excellence. Those are all true, but he said, yes, but how is it done? What are the nitty-gritty steps of how it's done? So after observing lots of teachers, he took these general abstract ideas and he began to see commonalities. And so he broke it down, he labeled different strategies, different techniques that teachers used, and then he began to help every teacher know how to implement those as well. That's why this is a phenomenal resource. I never read it until about 3 years ago, after I'd been teaching for several years, and I found it great. And it's one of those that you can keep going back to. You can keep learning more. You can keep sharpening even the techniques that you implement that he talks about. You can take them to the next level. It is organized into 4 primary categories: checking for understanding, academic ethos, and that's just helping students achieve that high level of academic rigor. The ratio, which just means how can I get students to do as much of the thinking in the classroom as possible, rather than the teacher doing all the thinking. And then behavior and culture, which just talks about creating that positive classroom environment that we know will take our students far in their learning and in their developing of character. Now, the author doesn't use that term, developing character, but I do, because I know that the classroom culture we create will help our students to develop their character. Some tools and resources that you might also find with this book, especially if you purchase it new, which I did. I felt it was enough of an investment, a worthy investment for me to purchase new. It does come with a CD. But you can also access online with your purchase code. You can go online and see a lot of video samples of teachers demonstrating the techniques in a classroom, in a normal classroom, that he's talking about. So some of you might find it not only helpful to read about the techniques and his description of them, but then to see them in action. Another resource is the end of each chapter has a reflection and practice section. And that just has thinking prompts, even action prompts, which will take you from merely being excited about implementing these techniques into the classroom to actually knowing how to implement these techniques from the classroom. So it does have some of these extras that will help you make the most of the techniques that he gives. It was very hard to limit some of the techniques that I wanted to highlight to you, but some specific ones I want to bring out of the 62 that he talks about are that rejecting self-report. It is something we want to be careful with as educators, that as we're teaching, we're making sure our students are understanding. And if we find ourselves asking, do you understand? Do you have any questions? Those yes, no questions. Then what happens is the students are self-reporting, they're self-assessing, but they're not very skilled at self-assessing. So they might not know that they have a question. So Doug gives several ways of avoiding just those yes, no questions and really finding out whether your students are understanding what you're teaching or not. That second highlight is no opt-out. What do you do when a student says, I don't know, to a question? Well, he's got several techniques, several ideas to keep those students responsible for their learning. A third highlight is everybody writes. Boost your students' ability to think by giving them more opportunities to write in class, no matter what class you're teaching, not just English classes or writing classes. And again, you have several ideas, several suggestions there. And the last one is do it again. That's under the category of behavior and culture. What happens when you're teaching your students a procedure, or you've taught them a procedure, and one of them chooses not to do it or does it incorrectly? How can you maintain those high expectations, that orderly environment, when sometimes the students' desires don't match up with yours? So those are some specific strategies, and he breaks it down step by step to how you can do that and you can implement it in the classroom. So truly a great book. In addition to the helpful techniques, how he's just specified them and made them so concrete, he has a very easy, very conversational writing style. So very easy to read. Now, as you can see, it is a large book and you're in the middle of a school year. And as I said a few minutes ago, it's already starting out a little bit of a rougher school year in many ways. So I would encourage you not to feel as if you have to read the whole book, but perhaps read the beginning, read the foreword, get the idea of the book, and then there may be certain techniques that you know you'd like to improve on in your classroom. Go straight to that technique. He labels all the techniques there in the beginning, and you can find them under those 4 topics. So great way just to boost your teaching and to be more effective with the energy that you're putting into your students. A second resource I want to highlight to you in this category of teaching techniques is Barrick Rosenshine's article. Now, I say article because that means it's a lot shorter than a book. So one of the reasons this particular resource stands out is it's only 9 pages long, which means you can read it in one sitting. But it's Barrick Rosenshine's Principles of Instruction, Research-Based Strategies That All Teachers Should Know. This is a terrific resource. It is a succinct presentation of 10 principles with applicable suggestions for classroom implementation, and it's free. This was first printed, it was first published in 2012 in the magazine The American Educator, but there are a lot of free PDF copies of this if you just Google, if you just do an online search of the title and the author. And it's an excellent read for every educator. So perhaps you're a principal or an administrator watching this. This would be great to go through as a team, as a faculty team. This would be great as you have new teachers come in for them to read and just have a sense of unity about what are the expectations of good teaching that our schools have. And we can clarify that with this article. It is organized simply. It's just 10 principles that Rosenshine goes through, spreads across those 9 pages. But you would be surprised by how specific he can get. I know teachers are usually saying, I want some concrete takeaways that I can walk away with. Rosenshine's going to give them to you. Here, for example, on your screen, you see some good ways of making sure your students understand. We saw that in Limov's book. We see that again in Rosenshine. And that was, what are some good questions to ask to help the students to think, to help the students to give good answers that I can determine how much or perhaps how little they know. That's just one of the specifics he gives. There are others as well. There's not many tools and resources in this article, but he does have a long list of suggested readings and sources that he put at the end of his article. So if you find that you're interested in that type of reading, of going into some of the pedagogic research that is going on, those will be some great resources to look at. Before I talk about some specific highlights, let me emphasize why I bring out Rosenshine. We are, as a culture, as an American culture right now, we are being inundated by a lot of ideas, by a lot of maybe fads, maybe a little bit of a harsh word, but trends that are actually counter to good teaching. But they're becoming so common, they're becoming so popular that a lot of teachers naturally gravitate to them, thinking that if they're so popular, there's got to be a reason to it. And Rosenshine just comes through and he says, hey, these are the basic effective teaching principles that are going to work, not only because we've seen them work throughout history, but even research shows that they work. And so it really helps clarify the teacher's mind and stick with what is effective in the classroom. As I said, some specific highlights are his principle number 3, ask a large number of questions and check those students' responses. He gives some specific ways of getting to check multiple students' responses at one time. And then also his 5th principle, guide student practice. And that is with the idea, don't let your students practice independently too soon. As Rosenshine observed and did his research in so many classrooms, he noticed that the best, the most effective teachers would have more examples. They would elaborate their explanations, have additional checks for understanding as they were teaching before they let the students work on their own. Whereas not as effective teachers would teach the concept and then send their students to work. So he really emphasizes making sure that your students have learned what you are teaching them before you give them time to practice. And like Doug Limov, I would emphasize Rosenshine's resource to all teachers from K through 12th. And this is a good one to read maybe every 5 or 6 years and just keep grounded in what works and walk away with some of his specific examples as well. Some other recommendations that I would make under this category of teaching techniques is Anita Archer and Charles Hughes, their book Explicit Instruction, Effective and Efficient Teaching. This actually emphasizes teaching students that have some learning problems, but very interesting to note that what helps students with learning problems helps all students. My favorite chapter with this is honestly the first chapter, and that is because she emphasizes, like I said, the difference between instructing students or just letting them learn on their own. And that first chapter is typically a free sample chapter that you can find online. So before you purchase this, you might find that free sample chapter, read it, and then in later chapters, she gives a lot of specifics about how to articulate, how to teach certain subjects. I would recommend Explicit Instruction, perhaps more for upper elementary and middle school teachers. That seems to be the areas that the authors focus on. And a second book is simply Hollingsworth and Ibarra's book, Explicit Direct Instruction. And it just, again, gives some very specifics of what does good teaching look like? What does it mean for a teacher to teach and not just talk? Some great specifics in these two books that will really go along well with the first Limov's book and Rosenshine's article. Moving on to the next one, classroom management. We could spend a lot of time on classroom management, but let me bring out two resources and then a third secondary one. And the first is Lee Cantor's Assertive Discipline. I read Cantor's book, Assertive Discipline, when I was a college student, when I was going through my education classes, and I read it again a couple years ago. And you've probably experienced this too. Many of you have been teaching for many years. Probably several of you have been teaching a lot longer than I have. It's amazing how you can go back to something once you've taught for several years and just get more from it. And then go back to it again and get even more from it the more years you're in the classroom. So again, if some of these titles are familiar to you or you've read them before, if it's been a while, pick them up again. You'll probably enjoy them more that second time, that third time than you even did the first time. But Cantor's book explains and demonstrates clear management strategies, and it emphasizes building strong relationships with students. So oftentimes people have a negative view of classroom management or even the word discipline, thinking that it's very negative, it's very harsh, it's very cold. And Cantor emphasizes the relationship building that occurs when we work with our students. He organizes his third edition, which is the edition that I have here, into 4 parts. There's a more recent edition that has 6 parts, but I was looking over those parts, and most of them he's just reorganized the material, although he does take a slightly different approach in some of the beginning chapters of the 4th edition. So again, I think 3rd edition is still great. You might even be able to buy it cheaper if you buy it used. But 4th edition, I haven't read it, and as I said, there seemed to be a different approach in some of the early chapters, so I might withhold some of my complete endorsement until I see what that different approach is. But the later chapters, the mid to later chapters, all seem to be the same in the 4th edition as they were in the 3rd edition. The organization of it, though, in those 4 main parts, are managing behavior in today's classroom, making a classroom discipline plan, teaching responsible behavior to your students, not just expecting it of them, but teaching them, and then working with difficult students. So even a chapter directed to what happens when you have to implement some other techniques because of some students that are just difficult, and they're not, what works with most students doesn't work with them. We've all experienced students like that, and so he gives some ideas there. Probably one of the greatest resources of Cantor's book is in the book itself. He gives so many sample teacher dialogues. So whether you are a K through 3rd teacher or 4th through 6th or 7th through 12th, he has specific samples divided by grade level that has how a teacher would explain a rule, or how a teacher would teach a rule, or how a teacher would correct a student. It's like being able to walk into a classroom and observe it. It's just in written form instead of spoken form. Very helpful, very specific. He really just takes you by the hand and walks you through implementing effective management strategies with students. I had forgotten how helpful this book was until I had reread it, and I thought, wow, he really does cover everything well. Specific highlights that I have are his section on teaching the plan. And that's not just selecting and sharing classroom rules, but teaching those classroom rules. That's what helps students keep them and maintain them. And then also giving that supportive feedback. We know not to focus on the negative. We know that. But he gives some specific strategies of how to make sure you are focusing on the positive. Even something as simple as, hey, if in the back of your classroom you have a clock that you're often looking at, write a note on the clock large enough for you to see that reminds you, have you said something positive to your students today? Giving yourself goals like writing 2 positive notes per day to the parents of your students. So there's a lot of great ideas of giving that supportive feedback to them. This Lee Cantor, I would again recommend to all teachers, K through 12. It will suit you. As I said, even those sample dialogues are given for the specific levels. You don't even have to translate a general principle to your own grade level. It's already been done for you. The next book in this category of classroom management is Harry Wong's First Days of School, How to Be an Effective Teacher. This is a very common, very well-known book. So it is highly likely that most of you have read it, that most of you have heard it. But again, if it's been a couple years, read it again. Very helpful. I heard so many great things about this book before I read it. Again, probably close to 3 or 4 years ago. And so I have to admit, up until I got to the halfway point of the book, I did not like the book. It was driving me crazy. I wanted to pull out my hair. I wanted to throw the book out the door. It felt so jumbled. It felt so chaotic. Unlike Limov, who has a very smooth writing style, I do have to admit that the Wong's writing style is a bit choppy. All the information that they put in their book seems to be a bit disjointed. I was even talking to a teacher friend of mine saying, why does everyone say this is a great book? I can't stand it. But then I got to the second half of the book and everything seemed to coalesce, it seemed to come together, and what they meant to communicate came across strongly. They just drew it all in together. So if you're like me, and maybe you struggled with that first part of the book, keep reading. It comes together eventually at that point, and it will help you. Now, what the Wongs do is they present clear-cut steps for creating, for establishing, for reinforcing management strategies and practices. They actually reference all aspects of teaching. I just felt that they were strongest in that management area of procedures, of rules, of even discipline. So that's why I put them under this category. While they have 5 different sections, they really emphasize the 3 qualities of effective teaching. In fact, that's a phrase you'll see all the time. Effective teachers do this. Ineffective teachers do this. And they constantly use that phrase. And that is have positive expectations, manage the classroom, and master their lessons. So that's the 3 primary organizations of this book. I felt that their classroom management, as I said, was the strongest, but you're going to find a lot of good recommendations and positive expectations because it even emphasized dressing well and how we as teachers, the way we dress, how that gives our students a model, how that helps them with their expectations of who we are too. A lot of good specific tidbits. There are some tools and resources that come with this. There is an accompanying DVD if you purchase the book new, and that is a teacher teaching about implementing and using this book and the success she had in her classroom. And then if you go to effectiveteaching.com, you don't even need to put in a book code, but there's a lot of other resources that they reference in the book that just add to some of the points that they are trying to make. Some specific highlights of this is characteristics of a well-managed classroom. I like what Wong says on page 82. Effective teachers manage their classrooms. Ineffective teachers discipline their classrooms. Something to think about. And then also the fact that discipline plans have consequences. And if you'll bear with me for another quote, he says it this way. Consequences are not punishment. At the most, they may be considered penalties. Students are used to penalties, however, because there are penalties in the games they play. The issue is choice. People who cannot accept choice as part of responsible living cast themselves as victims. Victims blame others for their actions. Thus, it is advisable to spend more time discussing consequences than discussing rules. Successful people accept that life is a series of consequences, and consequences can be positive or negative. So some good points to think about, and then some good points to implement. And then a secondary recommendation in this category is simply Fred Jones's Tools for Teachers. Have you ever worked with students and the explanations that you've given helped about 90% of the students, but then 10% of your students, it still wasn't clicking to them? So you found a different way to explain it, a way that you didn't feel was as effective, but for some reason that way made it click for them? That's what I felt about Fred Jones's Tools for Teaching. He covers a lot of things that Wong does, that Cantor does, that Limov does, and yet he kind of comes at it from a unique perspective. I felt it was a good complement to the other books. It probably wasn't my favorite perspective, but I know that for some teachers, it might make it click for them even more than some of these other resources. Moving on to our next category, Christian education. It is rare that as Christian educators, we can find books that are written specifically for Christian educators. And the two books that I'm going to share with you today are genuinely phenomenal. The first book is Ardell Jaquo's Guide to Successful Christian Teaching. This is just wow. And the overview that I'm going to give you comes directly from the foreword. Dr. Janney was president of AACS, and this is printed and published through the American Association of Christian Schools. It's a little bit harder to get copies of because of that. I know Pensacola Christian College still manages to get copies of this because our students still use it in their classrooms, but a phenomenal book. And as you can see, not too thick. It won't take you too long to read it, but it's powerful. But Dr. Janney's foreword introduces it at this. It provides a practical philosophy for new teachers, communicates helpful procedures for experienced teachers, and gives uplifting inspiration to tired teachers. I recommend it to every Christian school teachers. It has 10 succinct chapters, and the highlights that I take away from it are that fourth chapter, Teaching Character. He says it like this: schools are habit factories. If pupils are not forming right habits of proper behavior and politeness, they are inevitably forming habits of inattention, heedlessness, wrong behavior, and rudeness. And again, Ardell Jaquo doesn't just give some great thinking statements like that, he gives specifics. In fact, when in his chapter on discipline, talking about how to warn students, how to deal with students, extremely specific about the teacher look, about a verbal comment, about how to speak with them after class. Some very strong specifics that you might not anticipate being in such a small book. So a powerful resource that is, as Dr. Janney said at the very beginning, uplifting, encouraging, and edifying. If you can get your hands on one of these copies, do so. I even tried to find another copy that I could say, whoever's the first to email me, I will send that copy to you. But I wasn't able to get my hands on one because the person I was going to buy it from didn't show up to our meeting. So email me. I'm going to try to find a way of seeing how I can make this more accessible to other teachers, and I'll continue to look at that. But if you'd be interested, let me know, and I'll try to find a way of showing you where you could purchase it as well. Even 1 or 2 copies spread around the school would be great. The second book I want to highlight under Christian education is called Mentoring and Modeling, Developing the Next Generation. I have a first generation book here, I have a first edition book. There is a second edition as well. This is by Drs. John Getch and Mark Rasmussen. They work with the West Coast Baptist Bible College there in California, so they're in the same state as you all. And what this book does is it challenges Christian leaders to effectively train and influence the young people in their care. So this is written to pastors, this is written to Christian parents, this is written to Sunday school teachers, as well as Christian school teachers. But when you read this, I first read this in 2017, it feels like it's written just for you. It feels as if, even though I fell in the category of Christian school teacher, as if that was the only person that it was written for. What they have done is they have organize the books into 2 main parts. Dr. John Getch writes the first part, and that's about cultivating the mindset of an influential Christian leader. And then Dr. Mark Rasmussen writes the second part, and that's about implementing the actions of an influential Christian leader. They may not have as many specific techniques to take away like Jaquo does, Wong does, or Limov does, but truly a inspiring and edifying, a challenging look at what it means to be Christian school teachers. So this is another must read. Although I haven't been able to look at the second edition in hand. I know what I've read about it does say that the second edition includes group or personal studies and discussion guides. So that might be a specific tool or resource that you could take away from the book. Some highlights that I want to bring out is training through trials. And that's where Dr. Getch really reminds us about just how much can be done and accomplished in us and in others going through difficult times. Do you have students right now that are going through difficult times? This would be a great chapter to read. Be reminding yourself and be encouraging them about how God uses difficult times. And then in Dr. Mark Rasmussen's portion, talking about wonders with words. I like what he says on page 125. What a hammer is to a carpenter or a brush is to a painter equates what words are to those whose calling it is to communicate truth. The end result of poorly chosen words may result in confusion, embarrassment, or even insult. So it's a challenge to teachers. What are the words you're learning? How are you continuing to expand your vocab? How are you helping your students expand their vocab? We're training them to communicate truth as well. So some great challenges that they have from there. Again, these two books are great for all teachers. And now we're going to go into the last category that we're going to talk about specific today, and that's just general education. I could have filled this category with so many books. I want to bring out two specifically, though. There is Mike Schmoker's Focus, Elevating the Essentials to Radically Improving Student Learning. What Schmoker does is he stresses simplicity and clarity in teaching by focusing on the elements that lead to the most successful learning. Similar to Rosenstein, he says, listen, a lot of what is going on and a lot of what is popular is not effective. What is effective, though, and these are the three priorities and the three ways he organizes it, is what we teach, how we teach, and literacy. Are we getting our students reading? Are we getting them writing? Are we getting them talking? And that's how he organizes it. In the first half of the book, he introduces those three essential elements we need to focus on. And then in the second half of the book, he applies those three elements to the different core subjects. How would that look like in history? How would that look like in math and science and English? And so some good application there, some good challenges too, to focus on what is most effective with the students. Some specific highlights are how he places such a tremendous emphasis on writing. He says it this way, more than perhaps any other activity, writing enhances students' ability to think, make connections, and achieve clarity, logic, and precision. Writing enables us to discern and then express critical distinctions between truth and half-truth, between good sense and attractive nonsense. Enormous power attaches to those who do write and can write. We want to be helping our students with that power, and he gives some helpful suggestions there. And then also strong discussion techniques, not just having a discussion with our students, but elevating that discussion to be greater emphasis on the learning portion, on the elocution as they agree with the classmate, as they disagree, some good, helpful, specific techniques from there. I would again recommend this to all teachers, probably more specifically to upper elementary and above, though I know lower elementary teachers would still get some, but the focus did seem to go a little bit higher, so maybe 4th grade and up. If I could hug a book, I would hug this book, and that is Gilbert Hyatt's The Art of Teaching. In fact, I do hug this book. Gilbert Hyatt wrote this book in 1950, and I read this as a college student training in my education classes, and then I read it again, like many of these books, several years as I had been teaching, and I walked away going, wow, Hyatt just hits the nail on the head. Have you ever just met a truly phenomenal educator and you just wanted to sit at their feet and learn everything you could from them? That's what Hyatt was. He understood what teaching is, the good and the bad, the pretty and the ugly, and he just shares it and he expresses it so well. So the short overview of this is simply that it is an inspirational and yet still practical examination of the teacher and then the teacher's methods. And so that's how he organizes it. There's the teacher, the teacher's methods, great teachers and their pupils, and then teaching in everyday life. And under the teacher, he talks about the qualities and abilities of a good teacher. That includes knowing your subject, liking your subject, knowing your students, liking your students, and the traits of memory, of willpower, and kindness. And I love his approach to kindness. When he talks about the teacher's methods, preparing, lecturing, questioning, my least favorite section is great teachers and their pupils. I did not like that section because he examines Socrates, Plato, Jesuit teachers, and he includes Jesus Christ in that. And the way he includes it, though, seems to put Christ at the same level as those other great teachers. And that's my least favorite part of the book. I don't like how it seems to put Christ just on the level of a great teacher, as opposed to saying he is the perfect teacher. He's the Son of God. So that would be my one E that I don't like. But you can either skip those chapters, come in at the end. The final chapter under that section is pretty good. And then his last part, he just talks about how nearly everybody's a teacher. If you're a businessman, you're teaching people. If you are a doctor, you're teaching people. If you're a parent, you're teaching people. So he sums it up like that. Some specific highlights. I love how he talks about kindness, because I feel as if in our culture, a kind teacher is one who's seen as always giving the students something, always just having that very gentle manner, and that's not how God made every teacher. So Hyatt brings out that kindness is beyond what we might initially assumed to be kindness. It's working hard, it's challenging our students, all of that is kindness. Pages 64 to 65, I love what he says about kindness. And then here's a simple one, just using the board to organize discussions. He gives a very practical strategy of while you're having discussions with your students, don't make it all oral. Use the chalkboard to have some organization. This is the initial question. These are some of the original points. This is what we've changed, and then here's the conclusion. So just some great suggestions. And as I said, we won't specify that last section of cognitive science, but if you're looking at your handout, you have Daniel T. Willingham's Why Don't Students Like School? I only have the cover because I've loaned the book, as I tend to do with a lot of my books, to a fellow educator. But, oh boy, if you're putting a star by anything, put a star by this one. This is really good. Again, not just talking about the science, but the actions and the techniques behind it too. Deans for Impact, the Science of Learning, you can go to their website. That's a free white page. Very simply, again, talks about this is how students learn. And this is why these particular strategies of teaching are effective and why these ones over here aren't. And then Peter Browning's, I'm currently reading this, Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning, and really emphasize how students learn and how they remember things. So some great combinations here, some great resources. I hope you take at least one. And in the next year, whether it's Christmas break, whether it's starting in May or June when school lets out, you read one of these resources. And if you read it looking to improve, you will improve as we book it down that pathway of learning. So thank you for taking the time to tune in to this virtual suggestion or this virtual session. I'm sorry, as you can see, it's been a long day of teaching. I'm a little bit tongue-tied at this point. But I hope to hear from some of you. Again, if you have some book recommendations, you have questions about some of these, I'll be happy to go into greater detail, maybe narrow down which book or which resource you do choose to read first. Email me at cquinlan@abeka.com. And in the meantime, I pray that you're refreshed with the other sessions, that the other speakers have worked hard to put it together, and that the Lord continues to use you in this year with your students in the classroom.